Have you ever met an NDEer who discovered the truth for freedom and internal peace? And then this person actually lives this truth? David Morris is such a man. I felt lucky to have met him, and I'm luckier still to call him a friend. He has quite the story, and he has quite the perspective. David is a man at peace who knows he can articulate how to achieve that peace and the freedom that that brings. Dave and his sister Nancy came to this studio to do this interview right there in my shop. He felt it was important to be in person. The result is stunning. Here's our interview with David Morris. All right, am I in the frame correctly?
The funny thing is, because it doesn't matter what I say yet. None of it does. But the Afterlife files.
Yeah.
It's about NDEs, stuff like that. The Afterlife, NDEs, whatever. It's the least important part of this to me.
So the most important part is?
The aftermath. 16 years worth. Most importantly, this moment.
This moment,
This
right
moment.
now.
Yeah. Now, to give you this moment, I've conceded to giving you those moments, which we'll share, but it's this moment. Yeah. So.
And what a wonderful introduction to the Afterlife Files. So with me today is David Morris. He has traveled from Pennsylvania to be with me here on this beautiful fall day in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. Welcome. Really glad you're here.
Thank you, Scott. It's good to be here.
So we first met at the Monroe Institute, where you wound up taking a class from me, and we had lots of really interesting discussions. And then most recently, we had a chance to chit-chat at the IANS conference. That's the near-death conference that was in Washington, D.C. this year, where we continued our conversation. And it occurred to me that you all should be involved in a conversation between the two of us. So I think the place to start, tell us your story.
My story. I'll share my story, which was 16 years ago, August 18th, 2007. Prior to that near-death experience, I spent a lot of years in the, I'll say it this way today, in the beautiful progression of drug addiction.
That's an interesting.
As unusual as that sounds, that's the way I'm going to say it today. Because I spent a lot of years, the better part of 25, starting with the sociable drug use, leading at some point to become drug abuse, and then finally a full-blown drug addiction, where I couldn't stay clean for a day. I just couldn't. Certainly thoughts of suicide, certainly thoughts of wanting to die, and no matter how much I wanted to stop, I just was unable. So for a former drug addict, I would say to the audience who may have someone that is in an addiction, and if so, if they're trying to understand it, if you've never been a drug addict or an alcoholic, I would even say, you will never understand what that person experiences, and when they're trying to stay clean, what goes on and why it is so hard, and a lot of times overdoses or alcoholics dying just from that toxicity of the alcohol. So that I just wanted to share. But the evening of my near-death experience,
Yeah.
That night when I was still in the grips of the addiction, I was so high on cocaine. And for me personally, with that addiction, there came a lot of paranoia. I was an isolator. You just let me have my drugs and leave me alone, and I can geek out, be paranoid, and what have you, and be crazy. Like if you said to me, what was your life like prior to your NDE, I would tell you it was insane madness.
Wow. Yeah.
And that's the best way in retrospect to describe it. The night when I overdosed, I was in my bedroom on the second floor in my mother's home, and I had a lot of cocaine. To be thorough on the addiction use, it was very unusual for me in how I used cocaine, but I will share that. I would take my finger and put my finger in a little bit of baking soda and put baking soda on my gums, and then I would ingest cocaine. And the point I'm sharing that with you about is when you use baking soda like that, it opens up your pores.
Oh, okay.
And then when you do the cocaine, it's in less than a minute. It's very intense. But that was the way I got high. That evening, I was quite high, and the paranoia happens as soon as I start getting high. And in my bedroom, I had two big sliding door closets. I was on the second floor. I had 3 windows in that room. It was a big one room upstairs. And I started to see the walls starting to crack around the windows. I started to see eyes inside the crack at the sliding doors.
Mm-hmm.
And I would tell you at that time, I thought the police were in my closets. I thought there were people outside the second floor window, and the wall was cracking around the window, and they were going to push the window in and come and get me. And that's the madness of my addiction and what happened to me every time at that point. So the nature of an addict is, if you're coming to get me, I'm going to do my drugs and you're not going to get them from me.
Oh my. Okay.
Yes. So in that moment, when I thought everything was closing in on me, what cocaine I had left, I put in my mouth and swallowed it, which was substantial. It didn't take long, a few minutes, and I remember falling face down to my bed. And as soon as I hit the bed, I lifted back out of my body. And as soon as I came out of my body, I just started falling into this darkness. And I could just, it was so fast. And I just kept falling. And there was nothing but darkness. And when I finally came to a stop, the only thing that was in front of me in this darkness was this beautifully cut square slab of some kind of stone, maybe marble, I don't know. But it was perfectly cut. And on that slab was my lifeless body laying there. Now, I didn't know what was happening, certainly. I could see my body laying there, and I could move around at will.
And you recognize it as your body?
Absolutely.
Okay.
It was me, lifeless. And I was in a panic. I didn't know what was happening. What I do know is through the whole experience I'll share, and even as I'm into this part in the darkness, I was no longer high. I mean, I was very clear-headed, but in a panic. And so as I moved around my body in this distraught panic, wondering what was going on, not knowing what was happening, I started to hear a gentle music, so to speak. I started to hear voices with that music. Mm-hmm. And it seemed to me at the time, as I was moving around, they were kind of trying to guide me.
So they were friendly voices.
They were friendly. Nothing. The only distraught happening there was me, you know. And as I got accustomed to the voices and starting to understand, they lifted me out of that space. I followed their guidance, and they lifted me up out of that darkness. And when I came back up out of that darkness, in the distance, I could see this light. Yeah. And as I watched the light began to get bigger, and we were getting closer and closer. It did not relieve the fear, the confusion. What I really thought in that moment was, this is it, I'm going to die, what have you. And as the light got close, I begged and pleaded for my life to be able to come back. And I always share this. I'm the youngest of 4 children. My mother, and I honor her in this way, she was my greatest teacher because all she ever did was love me. That's it. She was that way with everyone. She was that way with my siblings, you know. And that was her greatest teaching. When I was small, she gave me the greatest advice and the most simplest words of wisdom that I never understood for a long time. I would say, Mom, I'm going to play with so-and-so. And she would say to me, be good. That's it. There's so much power in that. If you pay attention to that, and if you live that. That was just an enormous amount of wisdom from this simple woman who was my mother, who only knew how to love. So back to the light.
You're pleading with somebody, anybody, somebody in particular?
The light is communicating, and we're communicating. It's telepathic. There's no words spoken, but you can understand. And I'm begging to let me go back, because how can I wake up, or not, pardon me, not wake up, but how can I be lying on the bed in my mother's second floor of her home, and my mother, who I just described, finds her son dead from an overdose. I just couldn't let that happen to my mother. So I begged for my life. I can tell you in that light, in the communication, even though I was in a panic, there were gifts given to me. I could tell you the gifts I knew in that moment. I could tell you in retrospect gifts. But I will tell you the three things I came back with from that experience in the light. There are no coincidences. Right? Life is one big paradox. And the last two words that were said to me, or conveyed to me, was just love. And after that, the next thing I remember was the paramedics standing me up. That's a moment I remember, and the other moment I remember was when I was being placed into the ambulance through the back doors of the ambulance.
Yeah.
That split second of going through the opening, and those are the only two things I remember. Until the following morning in the emergency room of the local hospital. At the hospital that morning when I woke up, my aunt who lived with my mother on the first floor was in the hospital. And I always share this note about the people who worked on me when I was brought into the emergency room. They conveyed to my aunt that morning, when people experience trauma in an emergency room and somebody passes, the medical team can come out to the loved ones and express, well, so-and-so died from this, or these causes were the happening of his death. The doctors told my aunt we had no medical explanation for why he was still alive.
Really?
They believed the condition I came in there, they felt it would have been
Toes up.
toes up.
Yeah.
That's a good way to put it. So that was my evening with the near-death experience, and I will, because it's 16 years, and a lot has happened. But when I came back, the first day home, and I always share this, my dear sister, who we were so close, and my addiction pushed us so far apart, and I caused her so much emotional pain. Just the pain of having her watch her brother go through this addiction. She was in the home when I came home. She was there with her husband. They were in town from North Carolina visiting. It was their last day, and they were leaving that day to go back to Carolina. And I was in the recliner downstairs, and my sister walked out of the bathroom, and she could see me sitting in that chair. And my sister looked at me and she said, "I'm done. I'll pray for you. Goodbye." And I always say, it was one of my sister's most courageous moments in her life, to walk away. It was magnificent for her, the courage that took. You know, I share with you, I make certain statements, this one just being one of them, is a retrospective statement, you know. A few months later, on a Sunday afternoon, I called my sister in North Carolina. Not to say I'm sorry, not to say forgive me, just one purpose. However long it takes you to heal, it's okay. And with that, I could tell she started crying. I started crying. And that was the healing process beginning. It was a beautiful phone call. And maybe that was in October, and the following spring, after, the months of winter and what have you, I used to go sit with my aunt who lived in a high-rise a few blocks from me. And she was a devout Christian. She had so many Post-its or bookmarkers in her Bible, and she knew the Bible inside and out. My dear Aunt Irene. And I used to go sit with her, and we would talk. And I didn't know where it was coming from, but it was coming out. And we would talk about the light. We'd talk about God. And there were these magnificent conversations. And afterwards, I would just be in awe, like how it just flowed. And not knowing when I would leave, my aunt would call my sister and say, Nancy, you have to see him. He's different. He's not the same. And naturally, my sister was skeptical, and certainly understandable. But over time, through these conversations with my aunt and her me not knowing, would call and talk to my sister. And the following spring, my sister and her husband extended an offer to come down and visit them. And so I took them up on that offer and went down and spent a week with them. I did partake for the first 5 years in a fellowship, a 12-step program.
So you started that right after you got out of the hospital?
A few days after, yes. A few days after, I knew people because I tried that in prior times, which even spent 30 days in a rehab and 6 weeks out of rehab. When I came out of rehab, everything was grand. 6 weeks later, I was getting high again, But I went down to visit them, and it was a beautiful week, and they would drop me off at a church where there was a meeting and what have you. And I always share this about my brother-in-law, because the next morning when I was in the kitchen with my sister, she shared with me, and her husband Dick wasn't there. She said, last night when you were walking to their Explorer, Dick said to me, there's something different about him. I just can't put my finger on it. But something's different. And, boy, I love him. My dear, go ahead.
So what was the, so after your NDE, the recovery took this time where it hadn't in the past. Am I reading that right?
Say that again, please.
So after your NDE, did your desire for cocaine go away? Were you able to say no? Because last time it didn't work.
The beauty of my experience, although distressing, some would label it distressing. You, my dear friend, would put it LTP, less than positive, and certainly it was that, and it was distressing what I experienced. But in retrospect, an enormous gift. It was the most divine intervention I could have ever hoped for. When I came back and woke up in that hospital the next day, and ever since, for 16 years, but I knew it right in the beginning, the obsession and the addiction were gone. You see, in retrospect, I could tell you that lifeless body laying on the slab in that darkness was the drug addict being laid to rest.
Oh, that's lovely.
It was beautiful. Yes. And so the addiction was gone. For addicts who struggle and try and stay clean and go to 12-step programs and what have you, I never struggled. I went for 5 years, made some beautiful friends who I still have today, but I never struggled. I would go and be encouraging and try to be helpful to others. But at some point, 5 years down the road, it just was time to move on. I like to describe when I came back. I came back as this 45-year-old infant, you see. There was this beautiful cleansing. I was this beautiful, pure sponge looking to absorb. Right? I was never a book reader. And a friend of mine handed me the first book I started to read. It was Conversations with God.
Lovely book.
Neil Donald Walsh. I read many of his books. But I started reading, and that was the first book I read. And read many others. One of the others early on was Lessons from the Light by Kenneth Ring. Many stories in there of near-death experiences. In the middle of the book, there's about 3 or 4 pages with little paragraphs of the after effects of an NDE. And I'm reading these after effects, and this is me. This is what I'm experiencing. And I'm reading these different paragraphs, and so many of them were me. What was happening? And it was the most comforting. That book was like these beautiful, loving arms hugging me and holding me and giving me such comfort. You know,
Your tribe is here.
it was magnificent. We could talk for quite a long time if I want to try and remember details. What I can tell you about the books is probably in the first 2 years I read about 40 books. Just about all spiritual books, different books. A lot of Neil Donald Walsh, Michael Singer, near-death books, Kenneth Ring, Raymond Moody, and so forth. There came a moment where I put the books down. And I will just remind to whoever may see this interview, this is just my experience. I will never tell anyone what they should do. I never use the word should. I will offer a suggestion. Do with it, if you like, something. Do nothing with it. Cast it away. But I'll never tell you what to do. I'm just sharing what I've experienced. So there came this moment when I put the books down. And what I mean by that is we use the term seeker. There's a lot of seekers. And I will say to you, I was seeking and absorbing information, trying to understand. And then there was this moment where I stopped seeking. And I just started to see the beauty of life. Of life. You see, we share about these experiences. And they're beautiful, and people are curious. People who don't have them are looking to understand a little more what's going to happen when we die. And that's all very lovely. For me personally, this is the ultimate gift of life. They say the gift of life. I love cliches. I love cliches. The gift of life. Like, I know when I actually die, it's going to be beautiful. And that's fine. I don't need to know anymore. I don't have the answers. The paradox of that is I am the answer. Just as you are. Just as anyone is. You see, there's a favorite line from Rumi, a couple lines that are my favorite lines of Rumi, who, if you don't know, is a 13th century poet. And Rumi said, I was knocking on the door. The door opened. I was knocking from inside.
Oh, that's lovely.
In here.
Yeah.
You see, the answers lie in here. We search everywhere out here for something to make us feel better. And I
Does it feel better? From your description, a lot of reading about an experience that's ineffable at its base. It's really hard to talk about. Did all that reading give you some context, some words that you could put your experience into? Am I reading that right?
well, I would say, coming from the situation or life I was living, being a drug addict,
Yeah.
cliches. Here's a cliche in addiction about an addict. The getting and using and finding the ways and means to get more. That's the life of a drug addict. Very simple, but very devastating and life destroying, not only for the addict, for the people around that addict. So to experience what I experienced in my NDE, I had no clarity. There was a cleansing, and this is all my retrospective peeling of the onion. So the books were very helpful. But there comes a moment like, I'm happy every day. Every day. Believe me, don't believe me. I don't really care. We're going to sit here and do this interview, and I will say this with anyone. I'll leave an impression with you. Whatever that impression is not important to me. It may be positive, it may be negative. It's never important to me. You will form an opinion of me, and it matters nothing to me what you think of me. What is important to me is what I offer you. You see, I live my day to be loving and kind for no reason. In that no reason lies all the freedom, all the peace, all the joy, all the happiness. You see, for me, I'm here to allow and to accept. And I'll just say for now, it's to allow and accept Scott Taylor for who he is and however he wants to be. And in that, there's enormous freedom. You see, I attach to nothing. We, as people, are looking for satisfaction from external things, stuff, relationships, what have you. And we are pulled in hundreds of directions with attachment to this, to that, to so many things, looking to be happy. And for a moment, we find it, and then it's gone. But so many never look in here. So I live my day to be loving and kind for no reason. It allows me to be happy every day. It allows me to live in this moment. I don't drag my story along with me. For certain reasons, I'll share my story. But the only important moment, and as I've shared in conversations with you before, whether we want to call it God, source, divine, the universe, what have you, this moment right here is the only moment that you can experience that. You're not going to experience it in a memory. You're not going to project into the future. This is the only moment. It's the only moment I'm given the opportunity to tickle your heart. It's so clean. It's perfect. Paradoxes of life. If we haven't said it, I'm sure most have thought it. And the thought or the statement is, I'm not perfect.
Really?
And the beauty, the paradox of that is, you are the essence of perfection. You just are.
There are two takeaways from this video that I'd like you to have. First are the three gifts that come from his NDE. The first of which is that there's no coincidences. Life is one big paradox and just love. I think that bears repeating. Just love. And the second, NDE as a metaphor. I think this is really interesting. Remember, he talked about his lifeless body laid to rest, an addiction laid to rest. And then he came out of the deep darkness into the darkness of his current self, which is capable of seeing the light. We may all live in darkness, and each of us are capable of seeing the light. So that's the end of part one of this interview. Please move on to part two because he has some really wonderful things to share with us. See you on the flip side.